Great. So thanks everyone for dialing in today. The point of this call is, as we're at the start of the work to deal with Sidekiq Redis, I just wanted to get everyone on the call together so that we can talk about what we're going to do and how we're going to arrange things, because this is one of the few projects in recent times where there are going to be this many people working on it in some way, shape, or form. And I just wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page before we got properly into it. So I just want to open it up to make sure that I'm looking at the right thing. So I'm still catching up on a lot of what happened over the last 2 weeks. And I see that the decision is now to do the first iteration of the work being to make the Catchall shard use two queues being default and mailers. And Sean, can you just give a quick summary of where we're at with this work, or with the preparation?
Why we're doing it, or what we're doing?
A bit of both. A bit of both.
Okay, so why we're doing it is because the Sidekiq Redis CPU saturation is approaching the limit, and we gained a bit by tweaking the BR-pop timeout we use, but that's not going to last for long. Craig set up an environment with the ability to sort of mimic our production workload on a Redis server, and obviously without doing the actual application work, but do the same sort of issue the same sort of commands to the Redis server, and try out various options. And reducing the number of queues for the Catchall shard had a big impact because, well, basically the CPU usage is caused by a combination of the large number of clients that we have, the length of the arguments in the BR-pop commands, and the distribution of the arguments in the BR-pop commands all represent queues that need work, that may have work in them, and the distribution of work within those queues. So the majority of the queues that we use are on the Catchall shard. There's like 300, I think we counted. And if we can, so we're listening to about 400 queues in total in production. If we can get the Catchall shard down to 2 queues, then we'll be listening to about 50 odd or 60 odd in the production, which will, is an order of magnitude difference. And that had a pretty significant CPU impact in Craig's tests. So that's why we're doing it. Because, also because the alternative options, this is quicker to get something out there, because the eventual goal will be to have a single queue per shard. But if we focus on the Catchall shard first, we sort of front load the benefit. We wouldn't see as much benefit from making the other shards a single queue per shard. It would be more for completeness and avoiding technical debt if we did that. What we're going to do is, so at the moment, the way we manage our shards is with queue selectors, which can select queues. So each worker in our application has a queue. We can select those queues that we listen to based on their name, which is what we were doing previously, or based on attributes. So we can say, give me all workers that belong to the search feature category, or give me all workers that that are memory bound and are high urgency, or whatever, and put those on a different shard. So the idea is to reuse that same idea, but to push it a level up. So instead of Sidekiq listening to queues that match these attributes, on the application side, we will say, if a job would match these attributes, put it into a queue with this name. And then on the infrastructure side, we just listen to default and mailers, and everything that should be in Catchall goes into default or mailers. The reason for the mailers one is just because that's a sort of built-in queue name that we don't directly control, and while we could manage it, it's not really important here. Two is basically as good as one in this case. In terms of,
I have a comment to that, but sorry for butting in.
I didn't really know where I was going to go next. So
yeah, it's something that's related, and it is that we saw an improvement from increasing the BR-pop timeout, right? That's a tweak we recently made. And one of the reasons we can't increase it even further is the reliability, the risk of losing jobs. And if we can get Sidekiq processes to listen on exactly one queue, then we can use a different Redis command. Then we can use the actually reliable fetcher instead of the semi-reliable fetcher. Although the actually reliable fetcher is written in a ridiculous way, and we'd have to rewrite it, but the underlying idea works.
Yeah, the Redis command it uses is logical.
Yeah, well, it uses the non-blocking one. It should use the
Yes.
blocking one and not sleep 5 seconds in between every queue, which is horrendous. So if it uses the blocking command that we want for this, then we could raise the timeout to 1 minute or something like that. And the timeout is part of the workload, because every time the timeout expires, every client needs to reconnect, and the Redis server needs to say, oh, this client didn't get any work. We give them new work. So
Yes.
that is a potential benefit. On the other hand, we don't know if I don't know enough about this problem. Like, if are clients starved for work a lot? Because if they're not starved for work, then this tearing down shouldn't be a problem in the first place. But so there are some possible benefits to really going down to one. That's, I guess, all I wanted to say.
Yeah,
But it's out
yeah,
of
and
scope for this project.
yeah, I think this is something we knew we would need to do like this time last year. Like, we knew we would need to do this at some point. It just wasn't a priority, and now it is, to, like, reduce this number of queues. And it's one of those situations where, unfortunately, the engineering work to add queues is much less than the engineering work to reduce queues, because like, an expanding migration is much easier than a contracting migration, essentially. So in terms of the work itself, sorry, my cat is headbutting my headphone cord. I haven't fully gotten around to like putting that in any kind of order yet. I know Wang Min and Bob, especially last week, did some work in like creating issues and like marking those relationships. I'm also wondering, actually, like, I sort of put the epic together just before I went away. So maybe actually it would be good for someone else to say how they see this working, rather than me just keep talking. So Bob or Wang Min, would either of you like to do that?
Okay. Actually, there are a lot of issues inside the epic, so I don't really know whether all of them are related or we put a lot of them into. So maybe
So I think if we just sort
go
of start from where we need to get to, and then we can work backwards from there.
Okay, so I think the most important one is to add the ability to route a Sidekiq job to a different queue. So there is still an ongoing discussion inside that issue, and we haven't come to the conclusion yet. But in theory, I propose to just replicate the horn routing mapping from the version right now into our configuration in the future. It means that right now we are splitting all the jobs into different shades, and each one will have some selector, like the resource boundary or the feature category. And during the migration, we just copy all of them and put a name just exactly the one into the mapping routing. And during the migration, we just can just move to like rolling out the mapping routing to one by one. And after that, we can just like cut off everything and just default everything to the default queue again. So I think we can just read the detailed description inside the issue instead.
I think there's one other problem that that is sort of blocking the project, and that is the job submitted by new code being picked up by a server running old code.
Yeah.
During a deploy, because I think we know this is going to be a problem, because they are going to Sidekiq will throw them in a retry queue, and the retry queues are set to throw things out very quickly. So we're going to lose jobs during deploys. And so we can't safely turn this on and have deploys at the same time unless we solve that problem. So besides the ability to route, I think we also need to have a safety mechanism for that, or we can't do anything.
Well, so we can. I'll just share a thing from that issue that Wang Min was just mentioning, because I think it depends on, what is that? Oh, right, yeah, that's the issue. I think it depends on how we do that. So for instance, this is the issue where Wangman and I have been discussing it. So we discussed a few options. But one I was thinking of was, so we have in our config, we have a mapping of selectors to queue names. So these are two very simple ones just to get the idea across. And we then need two special cases, which is not ideal. So one special case is like actually this select. So the idea is that the first selector that matches, the application takes that and says, pass it to this queue. So for Catchall to work, it needs to be the last one, and it needs to use the star selector, which we already support, which says like any queue, obviously. So if the first one that matches wins, then we just put all the other queues, all the other shards in here, and then we put star at the end and map that to default. But then we have the problem that we don't want to do all the other shards first, which we would have to do in order for this to work. So we were talking about maybe making this go to null, and null means like consider this matched, but just send it to whatever queue it would have gone anyway. So I think this example from Wangman is a good example. So, you define your memory bound shard, but you say it goes to null, so it still goes to the same queue name. So this should effectively be a no-op, like configuration wise, if we started adding this with null on the right hand side. Then, like I said, we can do star to default to make everything move, but we could start this with just say like moving queues of a specific name to default that already exists. So then we don't actually need to solve the, we don't technically need to solve the new jobs, new workers problem first. We do need to solve it before we finish this, but, it doesn't block in the same way because we can still move some things to default, which is probably a useful thing to be able to do anyway. We don't want to go from everything on Catchall goes to its own queue name to everything on Catchall goes to default. Ideally, we would be able to break that up.
You pick and choose individual jobs and say this one goes to default, that one goes to default, and then you pick jobs that are already deployed everywhere or recognized everywhere.
Yes, exactly. So we'd pick that for known jobs first because they're the easy case, and then we'd tackle the harder case.
Quick question: why null instead of default?
Because default is a queue name.
Yeah, but that's where we want it.
But that's the point, Bob. If they go into default and it's fancy new job class and it's on default, and somebody is listening on default with the old code, then they don't know what to do with fancy new job class. But if it says null and it goes on the named queue saying fancy new job class,
null doesn't mean default. Null means named. Okay.
Yeah, null means use whatever you were going to use. Just match at this point and stop processing. Essentially,
and do the old system, which gracefully handles new code being deployed.
Yes. So if it was a new worker and it got a null on the right hand side, it would go to its own queue. Nothing's listening to that queue until we deploy on the Sidekiq side. And once we deploy on the Sidekiq side, we start listening to that queue, and we also have the code in place to process that worker. Sorry, I did miss explaining that.
If I may make one pedantic suggestion, can we make the rules an array and not an object, because they're order dependent? And
that's a good point, because I was thinking GitLab RB and Ruby hashes are ordered, but I don't think that's true for like JSON, for instance. I'm
not sure it's strictly true for JSON. And if we make it an array, then there is no ambiguity about them being ordered.
Yeah, the only disadvantage with it being an array is that you could have the same selector on the left-hand side twice, which is meaningless.
And the first one wins.
Yeah, exactly. But I think realistically, that's not a problem because, like you said, the first one wins. It still does something. It's just meaningless.
It could also be a feature because you could have an override if you insert things at the top.
Yes. So this was the other reason I was thinking about doing it this way, is because we have this other issue about whether we want to build something specific to allow workers to not go to their queue. So like, say we have a massive problem with a bunch of, I don't know, some new worker jobs. And in the current situation, they would be going to the some new worker queue. and we would be able to like, stop listening to that queue or start listening to it on a different node or whatever. In practice, it doesn't really work very well because of our configuration being a mess.
In practice, do we ever do that?
No, but in this option, we could just add a selector at the top that says name equals some new worker, point it to this
somewhere else.
Yeah, or just null and send it to its own queue and then deal with that. And this sort of configuration should handle that case without needing a new feature specifically to handle that case, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's nice that the null idea gives you an automatic place to dump these things. And then, then you have a new problem because you run out of memory on Redis because all these jobs are being stored there and not getting processed. But
yeah, I mean, we wouldn't on GitLab.com, we would know what we were doing, hopefully. And
I still think we would never be doing this in the first place, because if you willfully stop processing jobs, then they accumulate and you have another problem.
Yeah, I think realistically we're more likely to delete than stop processing. But yeah, I think
deleting is still easier if they're on a named queue. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the only wrinkle with that is, so what I've just mentioned sounds great, but it does mean we would potentially need to do the processing twice. So so far I've been assuming that the processing happens on the client side. So Sidekiq client is what schedules the job and Sidekiq server is what processes the jobs. So if we do the processing on the client side, we say we're going to schedule this job, what queue does it go into? And then we look at this map or array of arrays and we say, which rule does it match first? Okay, it goes to whatever's on the right-hand side of that rule. But we could also do the same logic on the Sidekiq server side. So when we pick up a job, we say, is this in the right queue? Or should it be moved to a different queue based on the rules I have now?
I'm not sure that's really solving our problem, because the problem is that we subscribe to 400 different queues on the Redis server. And if we're going to send jobs somewhere else in the Sidekiq server, they've already gone through Redis in 400 different queues. And that's
so I'm saying we do both. So like the only reason I'm saying this is because if we wanted that rerouting to take effect for existing jobs, then we would need it to happen on the server side as well. But if we don't, then we can just put it in the client. But it's not a huge wrinkle. I'm just explaining why my solution there doesn't actually necessarily fully solve the problem, because it doesn't handle the existing jobs that are already in the default queue.
But what does it need to do? What does it need to handle with them?
So I'm saying that if the goal from SREs is to say that all of these jobs that are going to be processed for this problem worker don't happen on the default queue, then we would also need a server middleware to move the jobs to the right place. But like you said, if we don't want to process those jobs, we would probably just delete them, in which case we don't need the server middleware.
And we already have.
This is probably too much of a nuance to be even mentioning. Sorry.
Yeah, and I don't think that configuration changes are fast enough.
Right, that's the other thing. Like, how long would it take us to roll out the configuration change? What would the size of the queue be by the time we do it? That's already a sort of blocker to us doing this today, right? To stop listening to a queue. Like, how long does it take up to spin up the instances or pods that we need that don't listen to this queue, versus just letting that backlog of jobs drain? And I think Jakob already made this point in that issue. Like, what do we actually do in practice today? I think it's mostly
or we call this API, which deletes jobs which already exists. Yeah.
Right. So sorry, this has ended up quite unstructured, which is
that's a different problem. I think that's a different problem than what we were discussing.
Yeah, definitely my fault that this has ended up quite unstructured. So one of the goals is that we can route jobs to a different queue, and I don't think dealing with the new worker case necessarily blocks that, but obviously it blocks the completion of the entire thing, because we need to solve that at some point.
Yeah, it is a requirement.
Yeah. Another problem is the observability. So mainly our dashboards and alerting, like at the moment are queue based. We need to add a parallel set that are worker based, because well, we're migrating. So while we're doing this migration, we'll have this going on. But even once we're fully migrated, we'll still want to know what's happening with the default queue and what's happening with this specific worker, because there'll be two separate concepts. Whereas right now, what's happening with the queue and what's happening with the worker mean the same thing, because every worker has its own queue. So we need to do that.
It's probably good to create an issue now that starts talking about how the migration is going to happen, because, or how the rollout is going to happen and what we'll need to look out for there. I'm worried that if we don't raise that soon enough, we'll get to the end of the
trunk.
Yeah, that's the intent of 989, but it's not very fleshed out at the moment.
Okay.
For instance, item 3 says manually ? Migrate scheduled jobs from those queues to the correct queue. So
I think we're also a little bit, it's not, to me, it's not 100% clear yet what the end situation is going to be. And that is also, that influences what the rollout is.
So yeah, I have one way of interpreting that, which is that currently we have 2 to 3 Catchall shards, because we have a Catchall on VMs, we have a Catchall on Kubernetes, and we have a catch NFS on VMs. So ideally, like at some point, all 3 of those would just be the Catchall shard. And right now they're not. But was that what you meant, Jakob, or was there something else that you meant?
My understanding is the end goal is those 3 things that you just mentioned, Kubernetes and 2 VM groups, are listening to 2 queues, mailers and default.
But this almost sounds like we're talking about SRE technical debt that maybe we shouldn't be solving as part of this project. Like, should it matter how many Catchall queues there are and what they're called? If we have...
No, that's why I'm saying Catchall is Catchall, and that's the 3 things that...
Oh, so Jakob, so are you saying like we could end up with... So let's forget we're using the name default for now. Let's say we end up with using one queue that's called Catchall VM, one queue that's called Catchall Kubernetes, or just Catchall, because that's going to be the future, and one queue that's called Catch NFS. And that's also an acceptable outcome because all 3 of the Catchall shards are listening to those queues individually, even though we've got 3 queues instead of 1.
Yeah, I think we should just have a general system that a system that is general enough to do the routing we want.
Mm-hmm.
And then exactly what that routing looks like on GitLab.com is more of an infrastructure problem than an application problem.
But we are in a team in infrastructure.
No, I know, but we're talking about making application changes to make this possible.
Yes. So as far as I'm concerned, but you know, this is just me, I think if we make the application changes to do this, but don't make sure that the infrastructure changes also happen, we may as well have not done this because, like I mentioned before, I think
no, that's not what I mean. Like we should also be rolling this out. It's just that you can design the system in a way where it makes very specific assumptions about how the infrastructure looks, or you can make it a little bit more general and say we can route, like, why does it's a little bit like yeah, the name Catchall suggests it's special, the name default suggests it's special, like there must be a Catchall, there must be a default, but is it, you know, like you can have you can just say people write expressions that match jobs and route them somewhere, and that's it. Or there must be one expression that catches everything, and that has a designated name, or it has a designated expression. Like why is Catchall special?
Because otherwise we need to... Wait, I think I understood the question.
Okay.
We need to have this this thing that has a star because we need to have a place to send new stuff. That's the new stuff is a different problem, but people right now, we have the queue selectors that magically add queues to the Catchall shard, and that's when we say Catchall shard. In this case, that's the Kubernetes one, and any new worker gets picked up by those pods.
But
and
is Catchall an application concept, or is it a GitLab.com infrastructure concept?
It's an infrastructure concept.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the application doesn't need to know what Catchall is.
No.
It just needs to be flexible enough to allow infrastructure to have 1 or 3 Catchalls.
Yes. So from the application perspective, the goal is like you can meet all of the routing requirements we have on GitLab.com, by pushing to an individual queue per shard. Now, what those queues are called is sort of deliberately an exercise for the reader at the moment, but like, you know, fundamentally, I think in the previous epic we sort of talked about this a bit, because if we let you name them anything, it's very easy for self-managed to get into a case where they're sending to a queue that nothing's listening to. And if we provide the queue names up front like we already do, then we can limit the risk of that. But then we also have to come up with names. So
no,
that's why I'm using default,
having,
because that kind of punts on that question.
Yeah, why having a default and having a star rule that points to default at the bottom of your table, that's useful, because that means that you have a basic case that's always going to work.
Yeah, so, well, implicitly, I guess at the bottom of this, even if you don't add it, there would be a star rule that points to null, right? Because that just means, like, with anything that's not matched by any other rule above, just do what you were doing before. And you don't need to write that in the configuration, because that way it's just,
okay,
there's no migration.
That touches on a different part of the project, which is that our initial goal is to come up with something better for GitLab.com and use on GitLab.com.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually, that should be the only way to do things.
Yes.
We should not carry forward queue per worker alongside this system.
No. And we are going to release GitLab 14.0 in June, I think, and 15.0 in May next year, I think is the plan. So
I don't think we're going to make June.
Exactly. You know, that's a problem for May next year. Is what I'm trying to say with that.
Yeah.
So, like, I guess the idea is that by the time we get to the end of this project, we have something that we can then use to do the rest of GitLab.com. Once we've done the rest of GitLab.com, we can start migrating self-managed towards this. Obviously, we can't force them to migrate towards this, but we can nudge.
Well, we can just make sure that Omnibus always inserts a default queue in the Sidekiq command line, and then at some point we just dump all the jobs there, and then their Sidekiq still works.
Yes. So yeah, I mean, yeah, but basically that's out of scope. But yeah, that's the idea, is that the eventual goal is that every GitLab instance, no GitLab instance, listens to 400 plus named queues.
Is any GitLab instance listening to are all of them listening to 400 plus named queues now?
Yeah, basically, unless you do anything else, like even if you run your GDK, your Sidekiq process will listen to like 400 named queues. Yeah.
I thought it listens to star.
Yeah, but star expands.
There's 400 queues.
To 400 queues.
That turns, like you say star, and then Sidekiq cluster turns that into a Sidekiq command that has this long list.
Doesn't that mean you need to use queue selectors? Like, are the queue selectors on by default?
The queue selectors are now on by default, yes, and Sidekiq cluster is also on by default. So the default configuration is one star, which expands into this long list.
Okay, but if people have selected star and we say, well, star now means you get default and mailers or something, then they don't care.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the only migration case we have for self-managed is for people who have actually done this, like who then, you know, we need to add deprecation warnings and say, like, this isn't going to work, do this instead, or whatever. Because at the moment, the knowledge of shards is local. So like the Catchall shard knows what queues it's listening to, and the memory bound shard knows what queues it's listening to, but there's no application instance that knows all the combinations of queues that are being listened to. Like, you know, the configuration is always local to the shard, whereas in this system, the configuration is always global, so every application instance knows all possible shards. Do you see what I'm saying there?
Yeah, although they may be out of date.
Yes, exactly. Like if you have configuration that says one thing on one instance and another thing on another instance, then you know you'll get varying results. But
so we are at the half hour.
Oh, sorry.
Having only booked this for the half an hour. I still think this has been a good conversation and probably gotten quite far sync versus having all of these conversations async. I just wanted to add one final thing, is that you'll see that I created a lounge, not a lounge channel. I created another channel yesterday, invited you all into that. As I said on the channel, this is an experiment to see how this goes with trying to hand over information about this project between the time zones to try and save people having to feel like they've got to pause through 7 hours worth of updates or change to then see what needs immediate attention. So the experiment is to try and put information about this project into this channel and see how that works. But please let me know if there's any concerns or problems that we run into if we do this. We'll do this just for this one and see how it goes.
Cool. Can I just, if I've got time, can I just quickly sort of go through? So the way I see it in terms of what we can start with is, we can start with routing Sidekiq jobs to a different queue, which, like Wang said, is the main thing we need to do. Like, you know, that's completely non-negotiable. And if we can't do that, then we can't do any of the rest. We can start on the dashboards and alerting stuff. It's not urgent that we start that now, but equally, in terms of recording rules and stuff, like probably the sooner the better.
And the labels are already there, so
yeah, it's not blocked on anything. Like we already have those labels.
To some extent, it may block us the moment we build something and we want to try it out in production. We want to have observability, so it is useful to have.
Similarly, the unknown worker case, that doesn't block the routing jobs to a different queue necessarily, but it does block the completion of the epic. Like we can't do that, so we could start that now, and we could also start with the Sidekiq Catchall configuration, and actually we could start.
I don't know what that actually means. Like,
yeah, I was going to look at that today and try and flesh it out a bit, but all I was trying to say was, like, have you looked at the Kubernetes configuration for Catchall?
Yes.
Yeah, it's an incredibly long line which lists a bunch of queue names, which is exactly not the point of what we were doing with the queue selectors. And I think if we fix that, even though it's not directly related to this incident, if we don't have to carry over that incredibly long line with all the names to this new configuration, that would probably benefit us in the long run.
I also haven't figured out where the star is. Like, we have a star somewhere because people can add workers, but I don't know where it is.
Yeah, I think. Sorry, it's like a 9,000 character line in our Kubernetes configuration that does catch all at the moment.
What is the case for solving this problem? I understand it's very obnoxious to have a 9,000 character line, but why do we have to solve this problem?
Well, we don't have to. That's what I'm saying. Like, I'm going to try and flesh that out a bit more today to, like, either make a case that this shouldn't or shouldn't be part of this epic. But it's mostly just like, this is infrastructure technical debt that, you know, maybe it's worth us fixing while we're here. Maybe it's not worth us fixing while we're here.
Maybe we're going to stumble over this while working on the project, and then it is worth
fixing. Or maybe we can just copy and paste that and it'll be fine. Like, who knows? I don't think we're going to rewrite it from scratch because it's impossible to reason about at the moment. So I think that last part is actually the most important thing. Is like, it's not really very easy to reason about our shards at the moment because we have this 9,000 character selector in there. So if we can get all the selectors down so they can fit on a page, which they should be able to, then that would help us. Like, it's the classic obviously no problems versus no obvious problems dichotomy. At the moment, I can say there are no obvious problems in this line because, like, it's 9,000 characters long, and how am I going to spot that? I would much rather be able to say there are.
There's nothing obvious about that line, so none of the obvious things is a problem either.
So yeah, and then yeah, there's some sort of additional nuances which I've created some issues for and some not, about scheduled jobs, because those live in their own set. So we need to do something with those, because otherwise, you know, the job payload is already in a set that will say, like, I'm going to this queue, but what if this queue isn't listened to anymore at the time we pull that job out of the set? So we probably need to figure out a way to migrate those. Similarly, cron jobs have their own set and hash. It's a weird setup in Redis for those, but I don't know if that gets rewritten on every application start, so maybe it's fine. So yeah, those are sort of minor things, but I think the big ones are the routing, the unknown workers, the different queue, the routing, unknown workers, the observability, and yeah, beyond that, I'll start looking at those, but I'll try and get those three ready to work on today, because I think those can all be done independently, and then I can start focusing on the rest of the project.
Great, thank you, Sean. That's really helpful. Cool. Anything else? No. Enjoy the rest of your days. Thanks so much for this call. Thanks so much.
Bye.